If you're using the Insta360 X5 for virtual tours, the settings you use will either save you hours or cost you hours. Get them wrong and your shots will be noticeably lacking in quality. Get them right and they'll wow viewers and maybe even win you your first paid client. So in this video, I'll show you why one of the simplest shooting modes of the X5 is by far the best choice for virtual tours in terms of getting professional quality and saving you a ton of time. Now, if you do want to learn how to make professional virtual tours without going through the years of trial and error that I went through, inside my Virtual Tour Pro course, I walk you through the exact step-by-step workflow I use from the moment you turn on your camera all the way through to the final published tour without needing any expensive gear or complicated editing software. If that sounds useful, then follow the link below to learn more. Okay, let's start by looking at the different photo modes of the X5. And a big change since the X4 and previous generations is that there is only one single photo mode this time. Instead of multiple modes here, you'll just find the one single photo mode. And under this mode, you'll find all the potential settings you might want to use for virtual tours. If you tap the bar at the bottom of the touch screen, this will bring up our different options. As you can see, we've got the self timer, resolution, and different photo modes. So firstly, the most basic mode you can use is HDR Photo off and resolution 72 megapixels. And this is going to be the right choice for casual social media shots where you don't necessarily need to increase the dynamic range. It also has options here under format where you've got pure shot and raw, or pure shot. Pure shot used to be a special setting, but now it's just the standard shooting mode. And what it does is it automatically enhances the photo quality by boosting dynamic range, reducing noise, and sharpening details, all before you ever touch the photo in editing. So at the bare minimum, you'll be using pure shot, but if you also want a raw DNG file, then there's the option here to shoot a raw simultaneously alongside the pure shot. Okay, so that's the most standard mode. The next one across is HDR Photo on, and this one also has both Pure Shot and Pure Shot Plus RAW. And with HDR, it's going to automatically shoot 3 different exposures and combine them together later in post-processing, resulting in a high dynamic range photo. The shooting resolutions for HDR are either 18 or 72 megapixels, so obviously 72 would be the choice if you are using HDR. The final photo option here is AEB, which is auto exposure bracketing. And this is basically a more manually controlled version of HDR where you're able to set the amount of photos it takes. So it goes all the way up to 7, and you can control how many stops apart these exposures are. I only discovered this later, but there's a secret menu here. If you swipe across, and if you're shooting 3 photos, you can go up to 4 stops apart. Then if you're going up to 7 photos, you can go up to 1.3 stops apart. This is a bit more advanced, but also more in line with how traditional DSLR photographers would shoot their HDR shots. The downside of AEB, however, is that the maximum resolution is 18 megapixels, which is a quarter of the 72 you can get with the other 2 modes. All right, so there are 3 main photo modes, but which one's best? Well, here I've got 2 of them side by side. On the left is the standard pure shot photo, not taken with RAW or anything. This is just straight out of the camera. And on the right, I have a HDR photo, which was processed in Insta360 Studio. When I move the field of view across to this bright window here, you'll see that the HDR mode has better dynamic range in this window panel, which seems to be capturing more detail than here. The sun is around here in the shot. So right away, this says that the HDR mode definitely captures better dynamic range. When I move the viewpoint across, you'll also see that this highlighted area has more detail with the HDR shot than the non-HDR shot. So definitely the HDR shot wins for dynamic range. If I zoom right into these chairs and table, I'd say the level of sharpness is pretty similar between the two, since both of these shots are at 72 megapixels, which is really good. And yeah, you wouldn't say either of them is particularly sharper than the other, especially when you look at the lines in the shot, like around the round table and the triangular thing. Therefore, HDR wins against single shot pure shot. Now I do want to point out to that one dude in the comments that yes, there is a little bit of purple fringing with the X5, but it's not that much. Compared to previous generations of these cameras and many other cameras, this is very minimal. And especially given the fact that people view virtual tours from a wider perspective around here, the mildest amount of purple fringing really is not the end of the world. Now you might be wondering how bracketing compares to inbuilt HDR. Well, again, I've got the side-by-sides here. The left is bracketing and the right is inbuilt HDR. And these bracketed shots have been color corrected in Affinity Photo. And from this first angle, the HDR photo easily wins. You can see there's much more detail there behind me in that bright window. Whereas here, those highlights are getting really close to white on the floorboards. Whereas on the right, all the detail is preserved. Then to point out the extremely obvious, look at the sharpness difference between bracketing and HDR, and this is purely because HDR allows you to shoot at 72 megapixels, whereas bracketing is currently limited to only 18 megapixels. So that's really not a great result, and these shots are going to look noticeably blurry unless you use an ultra wide angle perspective like this. Now let's take a look at the window just for argument's sake, and the HDR again performs better for dynamic range here. Again, you can see a lot of detail from this window panel, whereas here it's mostly blown out. So at this point in time, I see very little point in using bracketing when the inbuilt HDR does such a good job at dynamic range, and it will also be noticeably sharper than bracketing. In fact, here with bracketing, I'm seeing even more purple fringing due to 7 different shots being merged together. So it's basically merging all the purple fringing together into one photo. So yeah, it's a no-brainer that HDR mode wins. Okay, but should you use RAW mode with the X5? Well, I will say that the RAW shots do have a lot of flexibility in editing to bring up shadows and bring down highlights. And even in a couple of seconds, I've completely transformed this image from dull to impressive. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should use it, because don't forget, this is an extra workflow step. It's going to require time, learning a new software, paying for that software, and then there's the fact that there's lots of photos involved with making a virtual tour. So the quality had better be a lot better if you're going to go through all those extra steps. Well, now I'm working with the exact same shot, which is my inbuilt HDR shot. And here is the INSP file that was done in Insta360 Studio. And on the left is the RAW version, which I exported and then edited in Affinity Photo. And straight away, I much prefer the one on the right. If I zoom in, it seems to have a bit better detail and contrast. Then when it comes to dynamic range, they're both extremely good, but I'd probably give it to the inbuilt HDR with no RAW, because again, here in the brightest window, you're seeing slightly more detail. Also, the colors look better with this one, and this one was color corrected in Insta360 Studio, whereas this one was in Affinity Photo. And that is the icing on the cake. No longer do you need a separate software to color correct your shots, because it can be done right here in Insta360 Studio under the media processing tab. Here you'll find all the same color correction options that you'd use with videos, and the main sliders you'd use for virtual tours would be bringing the highlights down, bringing the shadows up just a little bit, increasing the vibrance, and adjusting the color temperature if your shot needs it. Now this is an optional step. You don't necessarily have to color correct, since I do think the shots straight out of the camera with the X5 are really, really good. But if you did want to, it's a very simple process. And another feature that you could potentially use in this workflow is the batch settings option, where you can apply all of your color correction adjustments to multiple photos at once. So if you had quite a few shots in very similar conditions in a virtual tour, and you know the color correction is going to look more or less the same, then batch color correcting is a really straightforward process. Just be aware that you can't color correct DNGs here in Insta360 Studio. The option is missing. So if you really wanted to edit a RAW shot, then unfortunately you're going to have to export it as a DNG and then edit it elsewhere. By the way, I'll link all of these samples down below if you want to check them out for yourself. All right, I think it's pretty obvious at this point which photo mode I recommend for virtual tours, and that is HDR Photo on and Pure Shot plus RAW, just so you're shooting a RAW file as backup if for some reason you mess up your shot and need the flexibility to edit the original RAW shot. And of course, using 72 megapixel resolution is a given. I always advocate for a simple workflow over a complicated one. If you can get great results with the absolute minimum amount of steps, then you absolutely should. And the Insta360 X5 really is good enough to keep that workflow down to a fraction of what it used to take using other cameras like previous generation Insta360 cameras, or even the Theta Z1, which was the leading 360 camera for many years for virtual tours, which unfortunately required lots and lots of steps from start to finish. And did I mention the fact that Insta360 Studio automatically merges all the HDR shots together right here in the software, which means you don't have to do it in another software. So I really do see Insta360 Studio as an all-in-one solution for editing your shots, including optimizing the stitching, which isn't always perfect for virtual tours. Sometimes you get weird cutoffs and double images. So here in the stitching optimization menu, you can try a bunch of options to see which one suits your image best. And that is looking pretty good. Then it's just a matter of exporting your shots. And here in the export menu, make sure you head over to export 360 photo. So it exports an equirectangular shot and not a reframed shot. And then click start export. Now, the only thing you can't do in Insta360 Studio is remove the tripod. So if you do have a tripod in shot, which you probably do if you're using a monopod, then my recommendation would be either removing it in Affinity Photo or the Touch Retouch app, both of which are 360 photo friendly. However, I will say that you don't need to learn Affinity Photo in terms of color correction and getting to know all the menus and all the stuff involved in learning a new software. And you also don't need to pay for color correction plugins with the X5, since the workflow I just showed you is everything you need to get great colors. So I really do see this workflow as a massive win. Not only do you get better results than any other shooting mode, but you also get the fastest workflow imaginable, which means you'll be able to turn over more photos from your virtual tours in a shorter amount of time without having to go into overcomplicated editing workflows that are just unnecessary. As you saw, these shots really are good enough to charge for, and you could totally start offering virtual tours to paid clients in your local area with the X5. If you want to learn how to do that, inside my Virtual Tour Pro course, I've got 3 entire modules dedicated to helping you start your virtual tour business. The first one focuses on business setup and choosing your niche. The second goes into depth about how to price and package your virtual tour services effectively. And the third teaches you everything you need to know about pitching and winning clients in your local area. If that sounds like something you want to explore, then follow the link below to learn more. And now that you have an understanding of the photo modes of the X5, next you may want to know what the other modes do. Well, in this video here, I go through every single mode of the X5 so you can know which ones matter and which ones you can completely forget.